Graphing an equation of a parabola with the vertex at the origin. Example 2, identify the focus, directrix, and axis of symmetry, then graph the equation. Letter A, negative 4x equals y squared. Now, the first thing I'm looking at in this equation is the fact that this starts with a negative 4x. Typically, in our standard form equation, we have just x equals 1 over 4p y squared. Well, in this case, I have a negative 4. So the first thing I'm going to look at is getting rid of that, and I'm going to divide both sides by negative 4. That's going to leave us with x equals negative 1/4. I'm just kind of rearranging here because there's a 1, y squared. Now, another thing you want to consider when you do this is which side is the squared variable on. So because the squared variable, the y squared, was already on the right, that's a good thing. We're going to leave it there. Now I have an equation that says x equals. And if I have an equation that says x equals, my first thought is, does the parabola open up and down? Or does the parabola open left and right? Well, because the y is squared, that's kind of the odd one. That's not the one we did before. We know that this graph is either going to open to the left or to the right. It's going to be one of those. The other thing I'm going to consider is the fact that this is negative. So because that's negative, I know the graph we're dealing with is this guy, which is going to point to the left or the negative direction. From there, I already know that my vertex is at 0, 0, so I'm going to put my vertex. I know that it's going to open this way, which I'm just doing with a dotted line because I'm going to erase this. But now, if I want to know exactly how it opens, I have to find my p-value. Now, keep in mind your p-value is right here. So if we're looking at our equation over here, we already have a 4. So this has to be 4p. So the question would become, well, what do you multiply 4 by to get 4p? Or what does p have to be? This one's not so hard to figure out, but if you get a harder one, what you would do is you take whatever's down here and you just divide it by 4, which is 1. So what that tells us is we now have x equals negative 1 over 4 times that number, 1, y squared, which means p is 1. Now, if p is 1, that means from my vertex, I'm going to go left 1, and I'm going to go right 1. And one of these is my focus, and one of these is my directrix. And based on the information we know that the parabola is pointing to the left, I know that this one is going to be my focus, and this one is going to be my directrix. So we now know that the focus is at negative 1, 0, and we know that the directrix is x equals negative 1. And make sure you list that as a line. If you just put negative 1, that's not enough information. Now, the other thing they want is they want the axis of symmetry. And keep in mind the axis of symmetry is the line that cuts the parabola in half, which in this case is the x-axis, which means now we have y equals 0. The last thing we have to do is we have to appropriately graph this thing. So try to remember at the beginning we had a conversation about the latus rectum, and the latus rectum is 4p. So the latus rectum is the distance from your focus up to your parabola and down to your parabola. So the latus rectum is 4p, which in this case is 4 times 1, which is 4. So that tells me I have to go up 2, and I have to go down 2, and those are 2 points on my parabola. So when I connect and create my parabola, I'm going to come from the vertex down through that point, and then up through that point, and then we have our parabola. Example B. Identify the focus, directrix, and the axis of symmetry, then graph the equation. So same as before, I'm going to start looking at the equation they gave us. The first thing I notice here is, do you notice they put the y squared on the left? I personally don't like that, so I'm just going to switch it. Now the next thing I don't like is that there's a 6 here, So I'm going to divide both sides by 6. So now I have x equals 1/6 y squared, which looks to me more like my standard form equation. Because the y is squared, I know that this thing is either going to open to the left or open to the right. And because the 1/6 is positive, I know that this one is going to look like this. We also know, because there's just an x and just a y, that our vertex is at 0, 0, so we can put that on there. And now we have to find p. Keep in mind that down here, that's 4p. So we're going to take 6. We're going to divide it by 4. If you simplify that, that's 3/2. So really what you're looking at here is x equals 1/4 times p, which we just found was 3/2, y squared. So now we know p is 3/2, which is 1.5. We also know that our parabola is going roughly like this. So I'm going to go 1.5 to the right, 1.5 to the left. My focus is going to be inside my parabola, which means my directrix is going to be back here. That gives me a focus at 3/2, 0. It gives me a directrix at x equals -3/2. And then it gives me an axis of symmetry still on the x-axis because it's horizontal, and it cuts my parabola in half. So now the last thing we have to figure out is how wide is our actual parabola. So we've got 4p, which is our latus rectum. If we do 4p, that's going to get us back to 6 because 4p is just sitting right here. So if I want that to be 6, then I'm going to go 3 up and 3 down from my focus. So come back to your focus and go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, which means when we draw our parabola, come from your vertex, hit that point, because that's what tells you how wide your parabola is. Letter C, -y equals x squared. So on this one, we already have the squared term on the right. That's good. The only thing we don't like here is that this guy is negative, so I'm just going to divide it off to put it on the other side. Y equals -1/1 x squared. Now, this one we actually don't have to do anything funny because this is really just y equals -x squared, and we should already know how to graph that because that's just a typical parabola we did in the past. So if y equals -x squared, then my vertex is at 0, 0. My quote-unquote a value from the past is -1. So from there, I should go over 1, down 1, over 1, down 1, and that's my parabola. But the problem here is they also want you to label your focus and directrix and your axis of symmetry. The axis of symmetry this time, x equals 0. We could do that one. But now we have to go find our focus and directrix. So if we're going to find our focus and directrix, I need to know our p value, which is going to be down here, and that's your 4p. So I'm going to take my 1 divided by 4, which is just 1/4. Y equals -1 over 4 times 1/4 x squared. If you think about it, 4 times 1/4 is just 1, which gets you back up here to this guy. But this tells me that p is 1/4. So from my vertex, I'm going to go up 1/4. I'm going to go down 1/4. Outside my parabola is my directrix. So I now know my directrix is at y equals 1/4. Inside my parabola is my focus. So I now know my focus is at 0, -1/4. And then just to see how we did, let's check that latus rectum. So your latus rectum, remember, is 4p, or up here, we already had it, your lattice rectum is 1. So from my focus, if my lattice rectum is 1, then I'm going to go out a half this way and a half this way, which would give me 1 total, which based on the picture we drew, looks like we did a good job. So that's the graph of your parabola. Letter D, y equals 0.5x squared. So first things first, we already have our x squared term over here. We already have our y term over here. This again is very similar to what we did at the beginning of the year, so you don't actually have to do anything fancy. But for the sake of finding your focus and directrix, we are going to do it the quote new way. Y equals, I'm going to take 0.5, I'm going to change it into 1/2. The reason I'm going to do this is so that I can find my p-value. The other thing I'm going to consider is that the x is squared. If the x is squared, this one's either pointing up or pointing down. Because it's a positive 1/2, I know that this guy is pointing up. I also know my vertex is at 0, 0. Then I'm going to find my p-value. So I have a 2. I'm going to take 2, divide it by 4. That's 1/2. So I know my p-value is 1/2. If I rewrite it, y equals 1 over 4 times p, x squared. So if p is 1/2 and we know that the parabola points up, that means we're going to go up a half and we're going to go down a half. Your directrix is outside. So we now know the directrix is at y equals negative 1/2. And we know that the focus is at 0, 1/2. We also know that the axis of symmetry is at x equals 0 because it's the vertical line that's going to cut it in half. And then the last thing I need is my lattice rectum, which is 2. That's 4p. So if I come from my focus and I have to do 2, that means I'm going to do 1 over here and I'm going to do 1 over here because 1 plus 1 is 2 altogether. So from your vertex, connect. From your vertex, connect, and you're done.